In total, in 2019, China has a population of more than 1.4 billion. In 1919, China's population was estimated to be about 4,668,550. That means that in the past 100 years, China's population has raised more than 1.3 billion, which is more than the entire population of North America. Today, China accounts for about 19.5% of the world's total population, which is to say that nearly 1 in 5 of all people living on Earth live in China. Overpopulation in such vast numbers raises large concerns of lack of resources or overuse of resources, leading to problems like hunger and global warming. As such, in 1979, when China's population was about 970 million, Deng Xiaoping introduced the One-Child Policy Act, which aimed at curbing the country's extreme population growth. The One-Child Policy made it so Han Chinese families, which account for the majority of people living in China, could only have one child. Minorities and those living in rural areas were the only ones excused from this law. Those who broke the law were subject to punishment, which could be things such as fines, forced abortions, and even forced female sterilization. During the time of the One-Child Policy, Chinese families were closely watched. Many areas had people in charge of keeping track of who was pregnant, who was using birth control, and other such matters. Leaders of these affairs who were paid for their organizational services were called cluster leaders and kept track of up to 10 households' reproductive habits. Those who escaped the strict lines of reproducing in China were faced with steep fines for having a second child. Families with more than one child were faced with fines that tended to be between 5 and 10 times their annual disposable income. Failure to pay these fines would result in objects and belongings being taken from the house in order to pay them off, and possibly seizure of homes themselves. Especially at the start of the policy, women were often forgotten as human beings and seen only as carriers of children. Women found to be pregnant with more than one child were often taken from their homes and handcuffed. They were then taken to locations where they received forced abortions. This also sometimes occurred when women did not officially have a birth permit, which decreed them eligible to have a child. Besides forced abortions, many Chinese women were also forced into non-consensual sterilization. After the birth of their first child, women were often greeted by officials who tried to persuade them to get sterilized. Women were often hesitant. The mass sterilization occurring in China usually resulted in the operations being messy and harmful. Some forced sterilizations even resulted in patient deaths. Still, when mothers refused to get sterilized, promising instead to use birth control to prevent another pregnancy, they were told that promises weren't enough. In the end, most women ended up getting sterilized against their will, if only to protect themselves from the wrath of the officials at their door. In 1983 alone, more than 20 million Chinese people were sterilized, which is more than the populations of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles combined. Finally, at the very beginning of 2016, the one-child policy was officially ended, allowing Chinese families to have 2 children. In the 37 years that the policy was present in Chinese culture, it is estimated that it prevented more than 400 million births. However, it has also caused many issues for the children born during this time and the rest of the Chinese population. One of the main issues immediately found with the one-child policy was the preference for male heirs. In Chinese culture, male children are the preferred offspring. Because of this, many female fetuses were aborted. Those that survived until birth were often abandoned, placed in orphanages, or even killed so that parents might have another chance at having a son. Currently, there are about 34 million more men than women living in China. For perspective, the total population of New England, meaning Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, is just over 14 million. The extreme imbalance between women and men has created the issue of many Chinese men not being able to find wives or start families of their own. While this has certainly caused a rise in loneliness and depression amongst the Chinese male population, it has also brought serious issues upon Chinese females. Without many women present in the population to get married, trafficking and forced marriages have become horrifyingly common in China's culture, especially for girls between the ages of 13 and 16. Girls around this age are usually sold for between $2,000 and $3,000 in American currency. For this price, they are expected to be married to the chosen man for 3 years and deliver him at least one child. After this expectation is met, it is common for girls to be resold to the other men for the same purposes. Many young girls end up spending their whole lives being trafficked and used, often by the instructions of their own family. Besides severe gender imbalance, the one-child policy also presents the issue of an aging population. It is estimated that by 2030, that more than a quarter of the Chinese population will be over 60 years of age. This leaves only the children born during the one-child policy era and a few others to support their parents and families. In addition to an aging population, China now has an aging workforce. There are less people able to work, and so there is a possibility that the economy may suffer. The low amount of people being born and available to go into the workforce is one of the main reasons the one-child policy was ended, but its 37-year run still did significant damage. While the one-child policy was in place, Those that complied with the policy not only avoided punishment, but also received benefits, such as financial perks and more willing government assistance. However, those that did not comply with the law were often forced to hide their second children in order to avoid punishment for the parents and, of course, the kids of the households with more than one child. Because of this, many children born during this time were never documented. As such, it is almost as if they don't exist in the eyes of the government. This means it is difficult for them to find any sort of work, which of course leads to higher rates of unemployment and in turn higher rates of poverty, which is what the one-child policy hoped to avoid to begin with. Undocumented children have also faced difficulties when trying to receive an education. When it comes to the future of China's population, it has been discussed that all policies limiting children per family may be lifted sometime in the near future. It appears true that the government's main concern at this time is the economy. The one-child policy affected the workforce so much now that the government needs women to have more children in order to keep the economy from falling. Women are now being encouraged to marry and have children younger, especially those in university. This is somewhat controversial among Chinese women, though, as many do not want to have children at such a young age and find that it would prevent them from finishing their education or reaching their other goals. Still, the constant social urging and sexist views towards women's purpose in the world has many feeling pressured about what to do. In conclusion, while the one-child policy may have prevented many births and halted the exponential population increase, it is still questionable whether it did more harm than good. The next few years will have the struggle of population versus economics become one of great prevalence in China, arguably even greater than it was before the one-child policy was first enacted.